Dashiell Hammett was witness to America in the first half of the 20th century. These photographs are taken from newspaper headlines. They represent some of the events that Dashiell experienced, which became the undercurrent of his perspective. His own life influenced American culture with a succinct but immense talent. He invented the American private detective along with his unique vocabulary. He also helped formulate a fully American literary genre, hard-boiled detective fiction. Troubled by health problems and alcoholism, he pursued very little writing after the 1930s. Although his writing spanned only one decade, Hammett's publications are some of the most influential and important literary creations of the 20th century. The Great War, Prohibition, the Gangster, racism, and a Second World War. These were turbulent times in democracy's history. Dark clouds casting shadows onto life as the melding pot of America searched for its identity. Many, like Dashiell, experienced these events as the 20th century came into its own across the United States.
Book critic and NEA Director of Literature, David Kippen.
Hammett was born in 1894 in pretty rural Maryland on his grandfather's farm. Spent a lot of his youth in Baltimore. His father was kind of a ne'er-do-well, and so Hammett himself left school after just, I think, a year of high school and picked up odd jobs. He was a messenger boy for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. But nothing really clicked until he found the Pinkertons.
Julie Rivette.
My grandfather responded to an ad and took a job with Pinkerton's detective agency. It was the kind of job that was really well suited to his intellectual curiosity. He wasn't one to sit behind a desk and do the same thing day after day. Pinkerton's allowed him to go out in the world and experience things that he'd never experienced before. He got to meet all kinds of people, crooks and cops and all kinds of characters. So that kind of work helped him build his repertoire as a detective and as a writer.
Diane Johnson.
Hammett learned a lot from the Pinkerton Operatives Manual, which he quotes from in some of his early works. He learned a lot about detection and the sort of rough side of law enforcement and struggle.
Joe Gores.
Hammett had been a private eye. He knew what it was like to stand there and say, am I going to die? This guy that's shooting at me. I've been shot at a few times, and you always think, Jesus, oh God, you're scared stiff. And he's been there, and very few writers have been there.
In 1918, World War I was coming to a climax. Our troops were coming home, bringing with them the Spanish influenza and a need for volunteers. Dashiell was 24 when he left Pinkerton's to enlist in the Army. He served as an ambulance driver. Within 4 months of enlistment, however, he fell ill. The Army sent Dashiell to recover at Cushman Veterans Hospital in Tacoma, Washington. It was here that he met his first wife, Josie Dolan, a civilian nurse caring for soldiers and veterans. Dashiell was diagnosed with tuberculosis and given an honorable discharge from the Army. After recovering at Cushman, he regained his strength and moved to San Francisco, California upon his release. Josie Dolan joined Dashiell there in July of 1921. They were married at St. Mary's Cathedral. Their first child, Mary, was born in October of the same year. These photos were taken on the roof at Crawford Apartments, their first address in San Francisco. Dashiell received a small disability pension each month from the Army, and with a family to support, he began to think of ways to supplement his income. After taking a creative writing course sponsored by the Veterans Bureau, Dashiell began to submit short stories to magazines. His first published work, The Parthian Shot, appeared in the October 1922 issue of The Smart Set, a literary magazine. Some of Hammett's earliest stories were published under the pseudonym Peter Collinson. His stories continued to be published in The Smart Set and, most importantly, in Black Mask, a magazine devoted to crime fiction. Black Mask soon became known as the premier outlet for the hard-boiled detective story. Several of Hammett's early stories helped to create this fictional prototype, particularly those featuring his character known as the Continental Op. The Op worked his way through difficult, violent cases involving many of the scenarios and characters now associated with pulp fiction. Double crosses, femme fatales, and detectives who operate under their own strict code of ethics. Although his crime stories were successful, Hammett still aspired to a more respectable place. He considered this place to be that of literature. A place he did achieve, as is often the case with history, after his death. His second daughter, Josephine, was born in May 1926. Soon after her birth, Hammett's doctors recommended, because of his medical condition, that he move away from his family in order to ensure the health of his children and wife. This separation would eventually become permanent. After writing over 100 short stories, Hammett published his first novel, Red Harvest, in 1929. This book featured the Continental Op working on a murder case in Poisonville, a setting based in part on Hammett's experiences while working with Pinkerton as a strikebreaker. A gangster movie, Roadhouse Nights, released in 1930, was loosely based upon this novel. His next novel, The Dane Curse, was published in July of 1929 and also featured the Continental Op, this time in an investigation of stolen diamonds. This novel was made into a television miniseries in 1978 starring James Coburn. Both of these novels resulted in an ever-growing fan base for Hammett's detective stories. In September of 1929, Black Mass serialized portions of what would become Hammett's third novel, The Maltese Falcon. The Maltese Falcon was published as a full novel in February of 1930. Depicted through the eyes of Hammett's new detective, Sam Spade, is the search for a valuable artifact, the medieval Malta tribute falcon. This dingus has sparked a series of murders and deceptions upon its journey into San Francisco. The Maltese Falcon was made into 3 different Hollywood movies. The first in 1931, of the same title. The second in 1936, titled Satan Met a Lady, starring Bette Davis. The third release of The Maltese Falcon in 1941 was immediately successful and has become a film noir classic. Even more than the Continental Op, Sam Spade came to be regarded as a primary character type in the crime fiction of this era.
Dashiell Hammett's 1930 novel, The Maltese Falcon, set a new high mark for detective fiction, one to which all serious future writers of the genre would aspire. Not only did Hammett introduce readers to a new kind of hard-boiled hero with Samuel Spade, he also gave us a book that crossed the line from pulp fiction to great literature. Novelist Adrian McKinty.
Maltese Falcon is a story of a detective called Sam Spade, and he's part of this detective agency of Spade and Archer, who are partners, and they have this small office in San Francisco. And into his office one day, a lady comes in who we subsequently learn is called Bridget O'Shaughnessy. And as the story goes on, we discover that she's involved in this nefarious scheme to get this object, this beautiful medieval object called the Maltese Falcon.
Literary critic Maureen Corrigan.
And Spade is also trying to solve the mystery of the death of his partner, Miles Archer, and the two plots seem to intertwine here.
Novelist Walter Mosley.
Hammett is always talking about heroes who are flawed. And so here you have Sam Spade, who's been having an affair with his partner's wife, and his partner gets murdered. And Sam Spade has to figure out where he stands in relation to the world after the murder of this partner who he's cuckolded.
Spade is competing with this group of criminals led by a mastermind named Gutman to try to find the Falcon first. And of course, also along the way, he meets the femme fatale, Bridget O'Shaughnessy.
At the start of the novel, the beautiful Bridget O'Shaughnessy enters Sam Spade's office with a phony story. But it doesn't take him long to learn her real motive for seeking his help. She's desperately trying to recover the priceless falcon before the others can find it. One by one, Spade meets the criminals who work with and often against Bridget. Adrian McKinney.
This is a very motley crew. These are people who you wouldn't ordinarily see together. Gutman is a guy who is obsessed with his own image. He's a bon vivant, a throwback character to a 19th century. Joel Cairo is unctuous and slimy and creepy. And then there's the punk kid enforcer. And he's very, very young and completely outgunned and outclassed by Spade.
Novelist Diane Johnson knows the setting of the Maltese Falcon well. She lives much of the year in Sam Spade's Fog City.
This book takes place in San Francisco, and it very much evokes the atmosphere of San Francisco with the fog and the hills and the little alleys and the atmosphere of a port with ships coming in, sinister people.
It actually takes place between December 5 and 10, 1928.
Dashiell Hammett's granddaughter, Julie Rivette.
You can walk through the novel, through the streets of San Francisco. You can find the same hotels, the same restaurants, the apartments, the streets.
Writer Joe Gores worked for years in San Francisco as a private detective and repo man. He also wrote the novel Hammett, which was made into a film in 1982.
San Francisco is a very interesting city to have a novel set in, because unlike almost any other major city, there's very little organized crime in San Francisco. Never has been. Back in the 20s, they used to send those guys back to Chicago in a boxcar and a coffin. You know, San Francisco, corruption was local and they wanted to keep it local.
More on Sam Spade and the Maltese Falcon film in Part 2. Hammett's fourth novel, published in 1931, was The Glass Key, a tale of political corruption and intrigue that featured a more mature writing style than much of Hammett's previous output. This was made into a Hollywood movie in 1935 starring George Raft, and again in 1942 starring Veronica Lake and Ellen Ladd. The story features gambler and racketeer Ned Beaumont, whose devotion to crooked political boss Paul Madvig leads him to investigate the murder of a local senator's son, while a potential gang war brews in the backdrop. In the early 1930s, Hammett moved to Hollywood to begin a career as a screenwriter. His film credits during this period include the story for the 1931 films City Streets and Woman in the Dark. While his family remained in San Francisco, Hammett kept up correspondence and visits with his wife and children, sharing with them the events of his new world. These photos are from the Hammett family album. During his Hollywood phase, he met authors Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, among others. Hammett also had several lovers in Los Angeles and met the woman with whom he would spend much of the rest of his life with, the young playwright Lillian Hellman. According to Hellman, she met Hammett in a Hollywood restaurant as he was coming off of a 5-day drinking binge, the type for which he would become notorious. Hellman had to create a distinct literary niche for herself, but during her years with Hammett, she would become a major American playwright. Their relationship continued on and off for many years. Hammett published his fifth and final novel in 1934. The Thin Man features the slightly amoral socialite couple Nick and Nora Charles, two of Hammett's most complex characters, as they attempt to solve a murder in New York City. Important in the context of Hammett's work is the development of his male protagonist away from his earlier creations. Nick, a former detective who prefers his relaxation time, is only reluctantly drawn into the mystery. Hammett sold the rights to the Nick and Nora Charles characters for $40,000 in 1937. The Thin Man series of films starring William Powell and Myrna Loy managed to remain popular well past the 1940s. Hammett never achieved great success in Hollywood, although he was well paid for his efforts. Several accounts exist of his drinking sprees and the enormous amounts of money that he spent on Lillian Hellman and their extravagant lifestyle. Hellman herself described these years after his arrival in Hollywood as alternately happy and unhappy. Despite his creative and physical deterioration, he attempted to stop drinking several times, but could only do so for short periods. Many other important American writers, including Fitzgerald and the novelist William Faulkner, also came to Hollywood during this period, only to see their careers falter.
Did you kill her?
Gilbert!
Well, why not? You had a perfectly good motive.
How'd you like to have a couple of little murderers for your children?
And maybe I haven't been on a merry-go-round since that day. Are you, anywhere near a solution? Between you and me, I think so. I got all the suspects together at a dinner party. And then I pulled a fast one. I told them, and the murderer is right here in this room tonight. He's sitting here at this table.
Hammett, despite his ill health and age, re-enlisted in the Army during the Second World War. After several postings, he was stationed in the Aleutian Islands, Alaska, and achieved the rank of sergeant. His daughter Jo, who provided the personal pictures of Dashiell's life, felt that his second Army stint was one of the happiest times in his life. After his return from the military, Hammett became involved in the service of left-wing causes, such as the New York Civil Rights Congress. This was an aid organization for people accused of communist-related activities by the U.S. House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC. HUAC was investigating the possible infiltration of communism into influential American institutions and industries. It considered the Hollywood motion picture industry to be especially susceptible to communist tendencies. Hammett was called before HUAC because of his involvement with the Civil Rights Congress, and he was jailed for several months after refusing to report the names of those who had funded many of its beneficiaries. Lillian Hellman was later blacklisted by HUAC. Hammett's years as a serious writer were far behind him. An incomplete autobiographical sketch he wrote called Tulip was eventually published as part of a larger collection of his stories edited by Hellman. Following a heart attack in the mid-1950s, Hammett stopped writing altogether. Hammett lived off and on with longtime companion Hellman on Martha's Vineyard for the last decade of his life.